Hi, LA Progressive Friends. We're back again with Andrea Mazzarino, who we've interviewed before and regularly are delighted to publish. Andrea is a activist and social worker who co-founded the Brown University Cost of War Project. Her recently published article, Rootless in an Increasingly Foreign Land, grew out of the book War and Health, the Medical Consequences of the Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. How are you doing, Andrea?
I'm good, thank you.
So when we hear about a war, Vietnam, Iraq, Ukraine, on, we typically hear how many soldiers have died. But your work focuses on the great many more people, civilians, older people, children who die because they're close to a war. Talk to us about the work you're doing in that area.
Well, myself and my colleagues at the Cost of War Project have, for years now, looked at the health impacts of war that go further out beyond the battlefield and decades after the battle's end. And those health effects include contaminated water because sanitation systems are bombed and don't function properly, which leads, of course, to all sorts of infectious diseases, some of which were eradicated decades ago. They include lack of clinics and hospitals because of air raids and bombings and explosions, in addition to doctors fleeing war zones. And factors like this, the destruction of infrastructure, means that families don't have anywhere to go in order to prevent and treat what are pretty basic illnesses. And the people who suffer the most are older people and very young people because their immune systems are more vulnerable. So those are some of the health effects, lack of access to health care, and then contaminated water, which leads to infectious disease among civilians.
So I would imagine that in addition to young people and very old people, there are people that are also vulnerable due to their pre-existing conditions, like maybe diabetics or, people who rely on medication to keep their lives going. Do we have any numbers on that kind of thing?
Well, I think I'm really glad you raised that because people with disabilities of various sorts, including diabetes and developmental disabilities, cancer, also are especially vulnerable. I don't have numbers on those specific issues, but we do know that exponentially more people die from war because of those indirect factors like chronic illness, injury, psychological trauma, than do directly on the battlefield. So people who are gunned down during a war. So three or four times as many are the estimates that the UN has offered. Um, and that's what I mean by exponentially more. And one person whose work that you could consult for specifically numbers on chronic disease is Max Skelton. He's an anthropologist. Maybe you've heard of his work. Um, and I forget where he is now, but his work chronicles the effects of war on health for folks like that who are
Okay,
struggling with
so
disease.
we'll look him up and put a link to, a video or something that he's done in the past. We'll put a link to that in this
Yeah,
piece. So thank you for that.
sure.
So this isn't the first article you've written about. You've written a whole series of them over a number of years. Have, do you see any sense that this has gained traction with people who are making the decisions to go to war, to prolong war, to keep the bombing going? Has anybody aligned with your project that has any kind of power?
I know that members of our project, including co-director, co-founder Nita Crawford, has testified before Congress, as have probably others. And former President Biden did reference the Cost of War project in one of his State of the Union addresses. So it's very clear that research from Cost of War has reached the ears of some of the most powerful policymakers. And whether that has directly influenced decision making is not clear. I mean, we did get out of Afghanistan. Um, and, I know how controversial the timing and nature of that was, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that our research may have had an effect on some of our leaders' less interventionist policies.
It's so amazing to me, the longer that we do this work at the LA Progressive, the more my eyes are opened about how disastrous some of our foreign policy decisions are, and things like the cost of war. I remember when I first discovered that website, I was just so jazzed that there was a way to compare how much we were spending on killing people and how much those same dollars could have educated someone or provided health care to someone. Does the cost of war look at, this is something I'm always thinking about, does it look at the ways in which average Americans earn a living in association with this war machine, and then they live in their nice suburban homes, and they're the people that are helping to support it? Do you make any connections there in the Cost of War project?
I think that we do, though not as explicitly and I think eloquently as you just framed it. We could probably be more direct, but an example would be economist Ryan Edwards' work on how war borrowing by our federal government in the first years after 9/11 affected interest rates for Americans buying a home. And one of the findings at the time when we first rolled out the project in 2011 was that Americans were spending hundreds more on debt for housing because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan, which were funded entirely on debt. So that's an example, I think, of the sort of connection you're talking about. But we could be saying more about how, these are wars that have been fought in every American's name. They're not just fought by troops.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, we are prevented of really seeing the horrors of war. I remember as a child, Vietnam, you could just turn the television on, the evening news, and there were reporters right there on the battlefield and cameras, and we'd see these horrors. And I think that contributed to the huge anti-Vietnam demonstrations, but we don't see that anymore.
Yeah, the war, certainly Israel's war in Gaza, has changed that a bit alongside social media exploding. But I do wish that when we have American boots on the ground, there was better exposure for journalists to what is actually happening. Dara Jamal of Cost of War has written a lot about the embed program in Iraq, where their access to wartime casualties was greatly controlled by the U.S. military. And I do wish that we had more information about armed conflict and the US's role in it in the dozens of countries where our troops are directly engaged. I think that would make a big difference.
Yeah, talking about the American boots on the ground, I believe from previous conversations and writings that in addition to being a researcher and writer, your social work has used to or may still involve working with American psychological casualties of war. Is that
Yes.
true?
Yes, that is, I see a range of different individuals, but my specialty is veterans and others affected by war, such as their families, and I do see some refugees as well. And I guess the point to come out of that experience, or one important one, is that many of war's injuries are invisible, and uh, that PTSD and suicide and depression and anxiety are very serious, underestimated in terms of number casualties of war, that our veteran population especially, bears the brunt of. And that means for many not being able to leave your house because loud noises scare you. It means having a hard time parenting a child or grandchild because you had to shoot at kids in war zones. It means things that many who have never known a service member or been in a conflict zone wouldn't dream of, but that haunt the minds of men and women who have served in America's wars. So I do deal directly with helping folks to process difficult memories and try to lead fuller lives once they come back here to the US.
Well, so I'm a veteran of combat in Vietnam, but as Sharon will tell you, I haven't been the least bit affected.
Well, we won't go into that discussion here. So,
Yeah.
so Andrea, the work that you're doing, I imagine, puts you into contact with people who are working hard to end wars, people like Code Pink and other organizations. Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel?
I Frankly, I think that it might come home to Americans just how deadly and pointless war is. The more we see our own government deploy military force against its own population. And you know better than I do living in LA what that's looked like. But and certainly in communities of color like Ferguson, that has been happening for quite some time. But I think that eventually Americans of all political stripes will probably get fed up with ICE raids in local businesses that deprive us of workers and, take away neighbors and friends and family members. And I'm hoping that that is actually going to be a wake-up call, as dire a silver lining that would be. I think that it might just wake folks up to what it means to have a militarized presence on our own soil.
Mhm. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for contributing your piece to the LA Progressive. Thank you for writing War and Health, the Medical Consequences of the Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I hate to say that. I hope that you contribute more because what you write on it's difficult. It's difficult for us to know that this is what our country is doing, but it's important that we know it. And we don't get this kind of coverage in other media. So I encourage all of our readers to get Andrea's book, to contribute to the LA Progressive, to like, to subscribe, to share, because independent media is the only place you're going to get these kinds of endorsements and this kind of information.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Dick, for your time and your interest in this topic.
Yeah, I must say, I'm always pleased when Tom Englehart sends one of your articles over for us. I really do, because I really, well, partly because I'm a veteran and have cared about veterans affairs for many years. It really strikes home what you write about. So I'm glad that people
Thank
are
you for your kind words.
some light on that.
Yeah.
All right. Have a great day.
You as well. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.